Welcome back, everyone, to this third and final session for today's conference, where we're going to discuss future perspectives, where to next when it comes to research topics and policy that will drive us towards our long-term climate and energy goals. We're going to kick off the session this morning with a keynote address from the Secretary-General of Ireland's Department of the Environment, Climate and Communications, Oonagh Buckley. And then we're going to move to a panel discussion session with a set of very learned speakers to delve into a range of interesting and essential research and policy topics. So first, to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Oonagh Buckley, who prior to taking up her current role as Secretary-General of DEC, served as Interim Chair of Onboard Pleanála, on secondment from her role as Deputy Secretary-General in the Department of Justice, prior to which she has had a vast and varied experience in Ireland's civil service. Oonagh is a graduate of UCC, the College of Europe, Belgium and Poland, and the University of London, and she was called to the bar in 1996. She has an MSc in Business from the UCD Smurfit School and has been an adjunct professor with the School of Law in UCC since 2017. So we're honoured and very grateful to Oonagh for her time today. It's my pleasure to welcome her to present to us now the keynote for our session. Thanks, Oonagh.
Thanks very much, and thanks all. I hope that in listening to my long career in the civil service, none of you think I was being moved around. I hopefully it's been onwards and upwards each time. And thanks very much for asking me to speak here this morning. I'm delighted to do so because it's a key topic for us in terms of the way in which we have to address the incredibly pressing global challenge of climate change and global warming. So I want, first of all, to start my address to you just to refer to the EU's Copernicus Climate Change Service report, the recent one which highlighted that the 2024 Northern Summer saw the highest global temperatures ever recorded, beating last year's record, which is likely to make this year the Earth's hottest year ever. And this data followed a season of heat waves around the world that scientists have stated were intensified by human-driven climate change. The impacts of climate change are increasingly frequent and severe, and scientific warnings about the dangers of the current pathway have become stronger than ever. And the case for transforming the global energy system in line with global climate targets has never been stronger or more pressing. And last December, when the gavel fell at COP28 in Dubai, a historic milestone was reached, and nearly 200 governments agreed on the need to triple renewable energy capacity globally and double energy efficiency improvements by 2030. This historic agreement charts the global journey away from fossil fuels and towards a pathway that limits global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. The world is now committed to tripling renewable energy capacity and doubling the rate of energy efficiency improvements by 2030, in line with the goals of the Global Renewables and Energy Efficiency Pledge. Ramping up renewables, improving energy efficiency, cutting methane emissions, and increasing electrification with available technologies is needed to deliver more than 80% of the emissions reductions needed by 2030. And in terms of looking at our energy efficiency, improvements in energy efficiency are critical to Ireland's emission reduction targets. Energy efficiency is an indispensable tool to accomplish multiple policy aims, and which can also ease pressures on consumers and to reduce their vulnerability to high and volatile fuel prices, while cutting reliance on fuel imports and driving progress towards climate goals. And I just want to say that one part of my department is focused on energy poverty and reducing the effects of that, which can be very real and very serious for individuals and individual families. But part of energy efficiency helps those people as well. The rate of improvement in global energy efficiency, however, has slowed over the past decade, and new efforts are needed towards 2030 to double the current pace of progress. Ireland has a specific challenge in this space. Under the recast Energy Efficiency Directive, which was agreed last year, Ireland has very ambitious targets for enhancing energy efficiency between now and 2030. There are enormous benefits arising from Irish society from embracing energy efficiency. I've mentioned lower energy bills, lower carbon emissions, of course, and enhanced energy security. And the first action of Ireland's recent energy security package is the full implementation of the Energy Efficiency Directive. Now, under the EED, the EU is committed to a binding target of reducing final energy consumption, or FEC, one of the many acronyms I've had to learn to know and love over the last year, by around 17% by 2030, which is compared to 2022 levels. But the targets at national level are indicative and not binding. But Ireland has notified the European Commission recently that we will aim to bring our energy use down by approximately 12.6% by 2030 compared to 2022. That is a uniquely ambitious target for Ireland. There are ambitious targets for all countries across Europe, but Ireland has unique challenges because we have a rapidly growing population and we have a very fast growing economy. And that sets Ireland apart in terms of our energy use. The latest projections from the SEAI modelling team indicate that further policies and measures that have already been planned will be required if Ireland is to meet this target. And an interdepartmental working group comprising all relevant government departments has now been established, and we've committed to identifying these further policies and measures to close the gap to the target. But I cannot emphasize enough that this will be an incredibly challenging target to achieve while continuing to maintain our economic growth path. As was evident from the recently published National Energy Balance compiled by the SEAI statistics team, Ireland's sectoral energy use is quite different from most of our fellow member states. While Ireland uses significantly less energy in our industry sector than the European average, we use significantly more energy in our transport sector. And at 43.2% of Ireland's FEC, transport now uses more energy than our residential and our industry sectors combined. Clearly, there's a lot of work to do to enhance energy efficiency in transport and to make it more sustainable. What was also evident from the figures released last week was the spectacular long-term progress which Ireland has made in energy efficiency in the residential sector, and the amount of energy used in Irish homes in 2023 was lower than any year since '97, despite the fact that Ireland's population has grown by 1.7 million or 47% since then. This is incredible progress which all the stakeholders involved and all Irish citizens must be proud, but we have to continue to enhance energy efficiency in Irish homes. That's largely through the use of heat pumps, through the rollout of district heating, and to move away from inefficient and carbon-emitting fossil fuel-based heating and power. And amid the climate warnings, one positive trend to note is that the increasing momentum to decarbonise could now lead to the fastest growth in renewable energy that we have seen. Last year, the world experienced an upsurge in clean energy, with 50% more renewables capacity added to energy systems around the globe in 2023 compared to the previous year. And this surge in renewable energy is evidence that renewables can rapidly scale up the energy transition required to align with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. In fact, at the moment, we're almost seeing the downsides of success because supply chains are so constrained in renewable energy. We're all competing for the same goods at the same time to upscale our renewable energy mix. DEC recently published its own Climate Action Plan 2024 that sets out a course for Ireland's targets to halve emissions by 2030 and to reach net zero no later than 2050. And these national targets align with Ireland's obligations under EU and international treaties, most notably the Paris Agreement and the European Green Deal. And obviously, we're shortly going to see the new Commission set a 2040 target for us, roughly along that pathway towards net zero in 2050. Now, central to achieving these goals is the strategic increase in the share of renewable energy to 80% by 2030. This includes ambitious targets of deploying 9 gigawatts of onshore wind, 8 gigawatts of solar power, and at least 5 gigawatts from offshore wind projects by 2030. And these measures are vital, not only for cutting electricity sector emissions, but also for enabling the broader electrification of all other sectors, thus multiplying the impact on our overall emissions reductions. The sequence is quite simple and quite clear. We push our energy system into renewables, and then we electrify heat and we electrify transport. It's quite a simple sequence, but saying it that it's a simple sequence doesn't make it any less difficult to do and any less challenging from a technical perspective. I've said this story before, Paul, and so some of you on the call may, or in the Zoom meeting may have heard it, but when I was growing up and studying geography in school, our InterCert geography book started with the mournful note, Ireland lies in the path of the Atlantic lows. And then it became a dirge as to how we had very few resources to avail of and we're on the periphery of Europe. How much has changed since the 80s. Now, our wind resource lying in those path of those famous Atlantic lows means Ireland is really well placed to have a competitive edge in a key area. And we can leverage our competitive position with regard to those natural resources. We have one of the best offshore wind resources in the world. Our vast maritime territory offers an untapped resource which can be the cornerstone of our energy transition. And the offshore wind space also has the potential to create tens of thousands of jobs in places where perhaps those jobs weren't available before off the western seaboard and the southern seaboard. And of course, those new investment opportunities that we should be tapping into. By 2030 and beyond, the development of offshore wind projects throughout our coastal areas has the potential to bring those enormous economic opportunities for coastal communities. As a country, we've already progressed our wind energy resources significantly. We're already, in fact, a wind energy success story, not that you'd hear that very often. We get a greater share of our electricity, 35% on average, from onshore wind farms. That's more than anyone else in Europe. In fact, we're world leaders in integrating renewables onto our grid, and that regularly sees 75% of total electricity demand come from wind farms. More capacity entered the planning system last year than ever before, and we want every year to be a record year. Indeed, last month saw record amounts of renewable energy produced for August in Ireland, according to the provisional data from Heatgrid. Around 898 gigawatt hours of electricity was generated from grid-connected wind farms in August, and that's the highest ever figure recorded for that month. So while most of us may have thought, God, we're having a miserable summer, we're actually producing an awful lot of renewable energy. Now, the results of Ireland's first offshore auction in May of last year marked an important breakthrough for Ireland's offshore wind energy sector and a significant step forward in the delivery of offshore renewable energy in the state. Over 3 gigawatts of capacity was procured from 4 offshore wind projects, and those phase 1 projects will provide enough energy to power over 2.5 million Irish homes with green electricity and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by over 1 million tonnes by 2030. We're also hoping to bring to Cabinet and then into the Oireachtas for statutory approval the first ever offshore wind DMAP. That's the one off the south coast, and that will be coming to government in the coming weeks. The role of interconnection, of course, has become increasingly important as the renewable energy sector provides a greater proportion of supply in the Irish and European electricity system, both for importing and exporting. So I know the vast proportion of people on this call are researchers, and it's important to highlight that in terms of energy research, government can play a central and wide-ranging role, not just in the provision of funds, which are very important, but in the setting of priorities and national objectives. Research and innovation will also be vital in meeting the climate objectives and challenges ahead. Now, in May of last year, May of this year, I beg your pardon, we launched our new research and innovation strategy, which commits DEC to harnessing research to its full potential to drive the action and innovation needed to develop a climate neutral, sustainable, digitally connected and resilient Ireland. And the new strategy is strongly informed by Impact 2030, the national strategy, and that highlights also research and innovation in the areas of climate, environment and sustainability. Our strategy sets out the mission to build our capacity to deliver and use research to drive innovation and action of policy development, implementation, operations, and particularly the rollout of new technologies. DEC, my department, currently invests around 50 million a year in research and innovation. So we're one of the top 5 government departments in terms of research funding. And these investments include the annual SEAI Research Development and Demonstration Call, which supports Ireland's transition towards a lower carbon society, the GSI Geothermal Research Programme, which makes strong contributions to our national plans for harnessing geothermal energy, and the annual EPA Research Call, which this year will provide up to 14.5 million to fund innovative projects that will support policy and decision making and address a wide range of climate change, environmental and sustainability challenges. And in the recently published Climate Action Plan of 2024, a key action of research and innovation is the development of an agreed framework to guide climate and climate-related strategic research and innovation. Our department will work with key stakeholders to develop an agreed framework to guide those the research and to provide a firm basis to ensure that a research system is positioned to work more collaboratively to deliver on strategic national priorities. So basically, how do we identify those areas we need to invest in and how best to deliver that investment? We're leading out on the development of that framework in the moment, and we have established a group to help draft it and deliver it. I should also mention behavioural insight. That plays a huge role when designing and implementing policies and effectively engaging with the public to buy in to what they need to do. And I've heard it say very simply that if we could persuade people to change how they travel around the island of Ireland and persuade them to heat their homes differently, we would have cracked the problem of what most people need to do to address successfully their own personal, if you like, emission profile. And I know that the SEAI's behavioural economics team has operated over a number of years and plays an important role in informing those policies and campaigns. Our National Dialogue on Climate Action initiative engages in that research to better understand what the public thinks, believes, and understands about climate change and climate action, and to understand the barriers they may face in taking climate action. The framework for that is the MAPS model. MAPS, which stands for motivation, ability, processing, physical, and social, are 5 dimensions that describe the various stages at which people can experience a barrier to climate action. And these dimensions guide us to appropriate policy interventions. And the insights we've gained have informed us that we need to work with communities to develop efficient and effective evidence-based policies with clear outcomes, and to get people to actively engage, to harness their ambition to address climate change, because people do want to do it. The question is, how do we enable them to do it? So we're establishing a system where those insights are made available to policymakers alongside the Research and Innovation Steering Committee to ensure that we are using these insights across all policy areas, and that we're building a strong base of evidence to guide us into the future. There's a huge number and variety of people and communities taking climate action and making changes. People are asking us for joined up thinking and ambitious policies to be reflected where they live, but there are still barriers such as lack of information, knowledge, resources, or capacity. But clearly we need to make climate change relevant to everyone, accessible to everyone, and promote a sense of huge urgency about it. The other part of this, I think, is around security of supply and cost. And obviously the war in Ukraine drove a huge increase in the cost of energy. It's demonstrated the need for government to prioritise cost of living challenges through the energy crisis. And of course, we've been working with the publication in 22 of the National Energy Security Framework and the launch of the Reduce Your Use campaign, which came as part of that. Our research shows us that people wanted simple, practical advice on how to reduce their energy use and reassurance about support measures. And we've also worked with key campaign partners such as Alone, which is an organisation that works with older people, and MABS to ensure that we reach those people who are most vulnerable to high energy costs. And those insights help us develop the Reduce Your Use campaign, which was a balanced message between reducing your energy use, but also staying warm and well. And obviously you'll have seen, hopefully all of you are aware of the ads across the many channels in this space. The OPW has reported at the time of the campaign, average energy savings of around 20% were achieved between October 22 and March 23, as compared to the same period a few years earlier. So expanding the scope of those campaigns will be a feature of our work going forward. We have a lot of challenges ahead. And we need the expertise of the people in this group and the wider community to help deliver on those. It cannot all be done by government or by civil servants. We need grid modernisation. We need to establish new transmission corridors to connect renewable resources such as solar PV projects, offshore wind turbines, and we also need, of course, we understand, to streamline planning and permitting procedures. We have to reskill workers in areas they're expected where we need the labour to actually deliver on all these challenging targets. Technical requirements will be changing, and this is particularly the case as regards retrofitting of homes, installation of heat pumps and district heating, installing wind turbines, and the development of the electricity grid. We know that our continued and important collaboration with the SEAI will be vital for overcoming these challenges as we look to position policy in a way that can enable energy technologies and research to overcome them. So look, I want to thank you for your interest in this area. Your role in developing research and in bringing innovation to the table is vital. I'm often reminded of the time 15 or 20 years ago when I was last involved in this area in the Department of Environment, where I was told quite firmly by engineers working in electricity that we could never get beyond 5% renewables on the grid because there would always need to be a base load of 95%. We've moved well beyond that. We have already innovated well beyond what we thought was capable 20 years ago or 15 years ago. And we need to make that evolution further because we need to get to 80% and beyond, and then change the rest of how we run our power system. Thanks very much for listening to me. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion.
Oonagh, thank you so much for providing the kickoff for this session and I guess this critical government perspective on where we have done things well and are currently doing them well, and also highlighting the urgency of the problem that we're trying to solve and the key challenges we face in our future transition away from fossil fuels. and they included the unprecedented rollout of technology, the need for more policy development, and you summed up there by listing some of the key areas, which of course are expanded on in the Climate Action Plan, and for giving us a clear sense too of the government's evolving and expanding support for research here in Ireland. And I'm sure researchers on the call are listening to government and will hopefully listen to this next panel session through the lens of what kind of research is going to be most useful in contributing to our acceleration from fossil fuels. So I'd like now to welcome our panel of speakers to join Oonagh for our discussion, where we're going to explore some of the research and policy topics more deeply in considering how we move away from fossil fuels. And I'm honoured to introduce them to you now. First, we have Dr. Trish Morgan, Assistant Professor, School of Communications at Dublin City University, whose research is concerned with the systemic aspects of environmental crisis and the communication of these multiple environmental issues. Welcome, Trish. Kevin O'Sullivan is Environment and Science Editor and former editor of the Irish Times. He has a special interest in climate disruption and solutions, renewable energy, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and sustainable food. And Sadhbh O'Neill, independent researcher and lecturer in climate ethics, climate policy, and governance and environmental politics. Sadhbh lectures occasionally at DCU and TU Dublin and writes for the Irish Times and has worked for numerous environmental advocacy organisations, most recently Friends of the Earth. Welcome, Sadhbh. And finally, Dr. David Connolly is CEO of Heatgrid Ireland, which develops and funds low-carbon district heating networks in Ireland, and he's chairperson of the Irish District Energy Association, which he co-founded in 2017, and he previously worked as an associate professor in Aalborg University in Denmark. Welcome, David, and it's an honour to have you all here for this panel discussion. I'm going to start with a question. We've heard a view here from the top level of deck there, with thanks to Oonagh, around the urgency and the global pledges made to doubling efficiency and tripling renewables. I think let's start with some of the policy landscape post 2030, and I might go to you first, Sadhbh. What do you see coming down the tracks from EU level in a policy sense, and what are the headline challenges do you think we're facing into?
Thanks very much, Jim. Lovely to be here. Well, certainly the focus of the next commission is going to be on the post-2030 landscape. When Commissioner von der Leyen was re-elected as president, she made it clear in her political guidelines that she proposed to amend the European climate law to adopt a 90% emission reduction target by 2040, which is a little bit less than what the European Scientific Advisory Board was recommending. But that is going to be a key feature of climate policy over the coming 5 years. Now, we still haven't seen the details of the portfolios of the next commission. They'll be announced next week, but the devil will be in the detail there in terms of the specific roles and responsibilities they have, and as a way of linking the energy poverty dimension to the greenhouse gas reduction and energy transformations. So obviously at a European level, we're going to have to get ourselves firmly on a pathway to climate neutrality, building out our renewable energy system and phasing out fossil fuels. And that speaks to the need really to be much more explicit in a policy sense about phasing out fossil fuels and not just seeing the additional of renewable capacity as sufficient, because clearly the Irish case proves that you can add renewable energy, but it doesn't mean that your consumption of fossil fuels is going down. And the only way to truly decarbonize the electricity system is to take fossil fuels out of the equation altogether. In terms of what's facing us here in Ireland, we're obviously coming up to a general election, and we're also looking at a review of our National Development Plan in 2025. And these critical opportunities, I think, are really so important for our decarbonisation process, because even though we have a climate law and we have carbon budgets, political priorities can easily lead us astray. If the National Development Plan isn't aligned with the carbon budgets and the climate law, then we will see investment in infrastructure or projects that may increase emissions instead of reducing them. Another critical point is, of course, the issue of data centres and their high level of electricity consumption, which is putting the grid under stress and also our decarbonisation goals. And clearly there just needs to be a policy change there. Whether it's a temporary or permanent moratorium is irrelevant. The point is that developing more data centers at a time of electricity and decarbonisation crunch is not sustainable. And I suppose I'll just finish off, Jim, by saying that, you know, we cannot emphasise enough the need to phase out fossil fuels. Fossil fuels need to lose their social licence in Ireland. And that means we should be supporting the introduction of an international treaty to phase out fossil fuels. And it also means that we need to look at the advertising of fossil fuels in Ireland. If we can treat fossil fuels like tobacco as the enemy here, the enemy of public health, the enemy of environmental sustainability and climate neutrality, I think it'll be a lot clearer to the public in terms of understanding and socialising the decarbonisation agenda that we have ahead of us. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Sadhbh, for that great answer, and you touched on a few points which we'll certainly come back to over the course of this panel discussion, particularly around the language around fossil fuel phase out. I just want to stay at the European level to start with, though, with the follow-up perhaps for Oonagh. We've strong laws established now here in Ireland, and very strong targets, as you mentioned, and they have a really sound legislative basis. We've got sectoral ceilings, carbon budgets and sectoral ceilings, and the certain challenges that go along with those. Could you say a little bit about the role of government and the civil service when, in terms of responding to Europe, and maybe in particular when politics changes in Ireland, and how does the civil service respond in kind?
Thanks, no, a very good point. So first of all, to say a change of government could repeal Ireland's climate law, but it wouldn't matter because we've more or less signed up to a similar target at European level. So our European commitments, now they're measuring different things and there's the ETS scheme, but roughly speaking, it means Ireland has to do more or less the same as it's committed to do under Ireland's climate law. Mm-hmm. The balance might change, but that doesn't change. So whatever government is formed after the next election, whenever that may be, we will be briefing that incoming government and saying, this is not something from the last government that you can ignore. This is something that Ireland is committed to do as part of the climate package that came from Europe. The other thing I should say, though, while oftentimes there can be a complete flip of approach on certain things. I mean, I won't get into the vexed subject of, say, housing policy, for example, where you do domestically have choices about how you approach those things. On climate, it's one of the areas where there's very little difference between, certainly all the major political parties in Ireland don't express any strong opposing views as to what's going on. People accept the science here, and they accept the need to deliver on that, and they accept Ireland as a responsible global citizen has to do its role here. So I mean, I've briefed the opposition parties myself, having come into this role. We've had a dialogue with them. That's not something that concerns me. They may concern about the edges, they may concern about the mix, but globally speaking, they're clear about the direction of travel. So that's quite reassuring because it means that, if you like, we're not having to turn around on a dial, every 5 years as part of the democratic process, which is fine, no problem doing that. I'm a civil servant, but those changes of emphasis can be difficult. The other thing I want to say, just a couple of things, just to flag that people have it in their heads and are things that are concerning us. Ireland will be the president of the European Union, will have the presidency in the second half of 2026. And that's while the 2040 target will be set shortly at global European level, EU level, the working through of what that means domestically and across the sectors will probably be underway for some time after that, and may well still be underway when Ireland is in the chair and has to take that neutral role in terms of delivering on those areas. So that could be quite an important role that Ireland will have, as well as, of course, being presidency of the European Union for that COP in 2026, which I'm already worrying about in terms of resourcing it myself, but that's a problem for the civil service and the leadership. I think that can I just pick up on a couple of other points made by Sadhbh? She's dead right to think about the NDP and the renegotiation of the NDP and the strategic priorities that the government of the day give to that. We have a big job to do, for example, in financing retrofitting of public buildings. And by public buildings, I mean schools and hospitals. And I'm not talking about government offices. I'm talking about buildings that the state uses, of which we have thousands across the country. And we are obliged to keep retrofitting them at a steady pace over the coming years. And the funding of that is going to be extremely challenging. There's also the piece around, do you invest in roads and rail and ports and all of those other things that we need to deliver our climate agenda. So those choices, and it's something that people could be thinking about at this point, because it's going to be a very important part for the next government to decide what to do. There was a mention of data centers. Now, without wading into the data center debate in any great way, I just want to flag to people that at some point we'll have more power coming in from the sea than Ireland could conceivably ever use, particularly under the Energy Efficiency Directive as currently designed. So we're going to need to use that power somehow. So what is the industrial use to which we will put it? And there's a choice to be made in that space, a choice that will be delivered in part by innovation around the types of works that we can do. Those choices will be important. And a choice will be, once various constraints are addressed, particularly around the transmission of power, in other words, around grid, that's when we will need to make those choices. And I'm not a person who thinks data centers are bad. Data centers are needed to power the digitalization of our economy. So, and Ireland is a digital powerhouse. And if we want to stay a digital powerhouse, we need data centers, whether we need them in Ireland or elsewhere. So it's just something that we need to be, they're not a bad thing. They are a thing that we need to manage through so that we can continue to grow our economy and continue to give a good quality of life and to be able to afford the sorts of investments that we need to address climate change. So I just wanted to say that there is a balance to the data center debate that perhaps doesn't get aired enough as part of this.
That's great. Thanks, Oonagh, for coming back there. And I think also for the reassurance that the science is locked into targets beyond the national level, at the national level, and also beyond. So the challenge of accelerating is not going to go away, which we're very grateful about, regardless of who's in government, and that there's a rock solid core there of civil servants who are grappling with this on a day-to-day basis, including some of the detailed topics that you touched on there, including data centers. And that raises the choices that we face, and the question of timing and compatibility with budgets and ecological ceilings that are set into legislation. So that's much appreciated. This morning, Emma Lynch from SEAI's modelling team showed us with the data that we're out of balance with demand growing faster than we're deploying renewables. So the need to sort of both scale renewables and reduce demand at the same time. David Connolly, as a person of experience with research and with wind advocacy organisations, and more recently with the private companies delivering on the ground some of these technologies that are much needed in terms of our transition away from fossil fuels, where would you observe that we've done well to date, and where maybe are we a little bit stuck, and what sort of ingredients do you think are needed to unstick us in some of those technology deployment areas?
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Jim, and thanks for having me. And I think maybe I'll do a bit of reflection on my career to date, because I think sometimes it's a matter of when they're needed as opposed to what's needed. So when I started in the energy sector in 2007, things like national targets, setting ambition levels was vital, because no one kind of knew what to do. But then around 2009, 2010, the All Island Grid Study came out in Ireland. It set target for 40% renewable electricity by 2020. It underpinned things like the DS3 scheme, the refit scheme, the grid allocation scheme. And then through the teens, having national targets and stuff almost took a back step, and it became all about delivery and implementation. How do you actually turn these targets into a reality? And I would argue that is an absolute phenomenal success story of policy making, setting a clear vision, industry of all different guises, whether it be people who built the wind farms, the Heatgrid and ESB networks who built the grid infrastructure, the CRU who provided the grid allocation and the DS3 services. Just a phenomenal success. And then I would say around 2017-18, we started to see the end of that 2020 cycle. And again, government targets became critical, because it was like, what happens after 2020? And I would say in that electricity world, the new 80% target has been set, and it's all about implementation again. And I'd hope we can show success in that sector again. Nowadays, I've no longer work in the electricity sector, I work in the heat sector. And I think the heat sector is doing really well at residential level and really struggling at scaling and doing things at a larger scale. Like, we're ultimately the lowest share of renewable heat in Europe at the moment, so we're struggling to just deploy. And I think when I look at the landscape on heat, I think we have our targets, like, as in, I think Oonagh almost took the words out of my mouth that I would hear in industry all the time. She was saying people do want to do it, we just have to show them how to enable it. Industry always says government do want to do it. We know government wants to do it, and we as industry are trying to show them how to enable it. And it's, I think, trying to, for the heat sector, how to scale up renewables is the challenge, I think, for the heat sector. And I think it's different to electricity in the sense that electricity has had 15, 20 years of success to build on, whereas heat is almost starting from scratch, and we're struggling to put in place the kind of foundations to get it out of the traps at scale that we need. So for me, the magic word, like, you know, I've been in the research world, I've been in the industrial world, I've been in the policy world. Like, for me, the most important thing at present is implementation. It's how do we accelerate implementation? I remember in one of our research papers back in 2011 or 12 we did for the Danish government at the time, we found that about 60% of the technologies exist today that we need to decarbonize our society. And I'd say that number has only increased since back then. But what we really struggle with is implementation at scale. And I think, you know, if we could get more research focused on how to implement and how to remove barriers for implementation and how to encourage implementation, I think that would be a very welcome pivot for the world of decarbonisation, whereas historically a lot of it has focused on, you know, national level policy making and planning and stuff rather than the nuts and bolts of implementation.
That's great. Thanks, David. Thanks for tying it back to the research. That was going to be my follow-up question in terms of how do we need to evolve research, you know, and it sounds like from that precedent of the success with electricity grid, that we're now sort of facing a similar speed bump in terms of delivery and implementation on the heat side. So research in that area is much welcome. So can I come back to you on that in terms of the policy challenges and applying them at the Irish level? You've reported on progress many times through your role with the Irish Times. What do you see as being some of the ingredients that might be missing to an acceleration here?
Well, I think the public perception of, unfortunately, at the SEAI is used to hearing this, and apologies in advance. The public perceives the grant schemes to be quite cumbersome, and that the whole process of retrofitting is extremely expensive. As it happens, I'm going through something myself. I'm at the beginning of a retrofitting project, and I can absolutely see the challenges. And if you're working with a number of grant schemes, the way they dovetail together is very, very difficult to manage. And the costs of doing it through the SEAI official way, the kind of gold standard, seems to be higher than what you might otherwise be able to do. So there are real challenges there, and that when we scale it up, we're looking then at how do we deal with energy poverty? How do we target the schemes at the most disadvantaged, and also in the rental sector? So some of those issues have been dealt with, you know, tentatively, I would say, in the Climate Action Plan. But in fact, local authority retrofitting schemes are happening at a very, very slow pace. And that's an area that I think we should be able to accelerate. And, you know, if the public can see that retrofitting isn't just about reducing emissions so that the government looks good, but actually delivers benefits directly to them and to their communities, and also, you know, generating new, more secure employment and more trades, you know, experts and crafts workers at a local level, I think that will be the game changer. And that's, you know, it's clearly in the cards, but how do we accelerate it? How do we bring all these benefits to people much more quickly? If we rely on the market alone and the sort of schemes that are up and running, I don't think it will happen fast enough.
That's great. Thanks for highlighting some of the challenges around quality delivery. And I think super important in the early stages, especially with new technologies like heat pumps, that we don't end up with poor quality installations that where you know 2 or 3 energy bills go through the roof, and the technology itself gets a bad name, where we know if we manage it. So maybe there is an element of caution at the moment. But you brought in the next topic that we want to explore more deeply, and that's about engaging people and society on this run. Away from fossil fuels, and you talked about scheme targeting. We heard from Andrew Magnuson this morning. He said people don't react to data, they react to stories. And we heard stories even from Oonagh about her experience hearing about with her textbooks back in the day. And we heard from Andrew this morning about his letter to the future and the eulogy for the glacier in Iceland, which was very moving. A question for Trish: how would you describe how we currently engage and communicate on climate topics now, and what's coming, and what ingredients do you think again are missing to really connect us to what we need to be doing today, and how we need to be acting?
Well, I think we have some exemplars from the past in Ireland. We have a recent enough one with the COVID pandemic, where clear communication did get many people on board with restrictions. Everybody got tired of them eventually, but certainly there was some success in that unity of the message, that we need to stay safe, we need to keep each other safe. Some of my colleagues would have worked on the Repealing the Eighth campaign, where that was kind of done again with stories. So as you're saying, that idea of having stories to kind of move people on a more level, that shows some promise. And then in the field of kind of climate change communication, my own work partly deals with novel communication of environmental issues broadly. So I see our crisis as much more of a planetary boundary crisis than climate. So excuse me if I sound a bit more, I guess, sort of less targeted about climate. But even if somebody came along and waved the climate crisis away tomorrow, we still have 8 other planetary boundaries that we and our economic systems and our growth-based models are not doing well with. So excuse me if I kind of talk about that as well. But I think in terms of communicating to people, we need to communicate opportunities. We need to communicate how things can be more beneficial if we get this correct. If we have less air pollution. So I believe that people are concerned about climate change in terms of air pollution, not necessarily the physics of climate change. So if, for example, we were to think about, well, can we tell good stories about how if we decarbonize, we reduce local air pollution? That could be, that could be a way of engaging people. I think a key thing, and Sadhbh touched on this as well, is around the kind of the sort of the social license for fossil fuels, and how that is tacitly communicated in Ireland by certain advertising, even though it's not like direct fossil fuel advertising necessarily, but other social norms around how we can use fossil fuels. I think that really needs to be looked at some more. And then also like that idea of a qualitative change for transition being a good thing. People are tired of their long commutes. People are tired of the cost of living crisis, which a colleague has described as the cost of profiteering crisis. So it's not that living costs us more, it's that, other entities are costing us more. So if we could give people a message around fairness in transition, economic fairness in some kind of way, I think that will go a long way in terms of our stories. And then we get into just using different means of communication. So I would have done work on, making environmental data not only visible, but also we can sonify environmental data, and we can use it basically all of our 5 senses in communication. And that's more maybe niche and maybe novel, but we can make these stories engaging. There's a whole field now emerging of climate comedy. Can climate change be kind of in a good-natured way be brought into communications in a kind of a more light-hearted way? So not everything has to be earnest. Not everything has to be about, how both terrible things are or about the massive challenge. But can we can we use stories the way we would use other narratives as well? And that looks promising, and certainly my students kind of do relate to that as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, but I do think we probably need to model ourselves on prior campaigns that engaged publics in that kind of positive way towards the benefits of transition.
That's great, Trish, and thanks for expanding the conversation out beyond just climate and highlighting the other planetary boundaries that are at risk. We had Kate Rayworth in Ireland there recently talking at some conferences about the donut economics model. We'll come back to system change maybe in a bit. You listed some of the benefits and wider issues and expanding out how we talk about this. My follow-up question might just be around how do we engage with the not yet engaged? Maybe there's a sense by some people in the sector that we talk in the eco chamber to each other about how urgent this is and what's needed, and other people have other priorities, and that could be down to different cohorts of society, those less privileged than ourselves perhaps, or who are struggling to be part of the transition. How do we communicate with them, and what do they want to see in order to become engaged with the cause?
Yeah, that's something I'm very passionate about, coming from a very working class background, not even being guaranteed to get to college, let alone, be working in a university. So I think what we need to do is kind of understand that we're not all in the same boat, and not all boats rise with the tide, as we've been told through kind of neoliberal economic frameworks of the last 40 to 50 years, that people are left behind. And if people are struggling because they need to work a couple of jobs or are time poor, the climate and environment is way down their list. And I think we really need to be sensitive about that. We need to, which is why, along with agreeing with Sadhbh on other matters, that idea of a climate justice, or a just transition within Ireland, I think that needs to be discussed a little bit more. If people are worried about putting food on the table and heating their homes, they don't have capacity for thinking about the environment. It seems out there, it seems somewhere else. And it might seem remote to them. And it might seem like, look, if it was that serious, the government would have done something by now. I'm sounding a little bit like how Greta Thunberg describes how she came to being an activist, that she thought as a child, oh, we've got this problem, but by the time I'm grown up, or by the time, I would be old enough to vote, this will be settled because people in power will organize to make sure this goes okay. So we do need to think about our own class position, our own social class position, our own privilege, as you've just mentioned, Jim. And I think if we want to engage people maybe who are struggling, we need to engage them sensitively. Maybe research is needed there, that people in typically unengaged groups are targeted as to why they're unengaged. Why is it not a priority? What are the other things in your life that are not working? It's not just, it's not just even necessarily kind of like social class. It's also just, do you feel the economy is working for you? Do you feel that like society is working for you? And, unfortunately, sometimes people don't feel that it is. They can't get a job near where they live. They can't get a job near where they live. They can't buy a house in the first place. So environment and climate is going to be lower down their list if they don't feel they have a baseline of safety, security, dignity, connection to others. So I think those big discussions might need to be had.
That's super. There's a lot in that, and a lot hopefully for researchers to absorb there. Kevin, can I come to you now as a real champion for journalism in the climate and energy space? To start by asking you, how have you seen the landscape change over the last little while, and maybe what do you think we need? What's the direction of evolution, or what do we need more of in the context of this future challenge?
Thanks, Jim. Well, I would certainly say the scenario that we're all in has changed dramatically in many ways for the good, in many ways for the bad. When you look at the climate science and tie in that with that the nature crisis and the lack of ability to implement effective adaptation measures, which was highlighted this week by the Climate Change Advisory Council. But as many of the previous speakers have highlighted, we're in a much better place in terms of climate understanding the science, and that's particularly strong in Ireland. And also the willingness of people across all society, communities, individuals, they want to do climate effective actions. And the trouble is sometimes they don't know, sometimes distracted, sometimes there's more immediacy in terms of issues in their lives, as Trish has highlighted. So there are big blockages there, and we can build on the progress we have achieved, in whether it's to do with adoption of renewables, in terms of improving our lifestyle, in terms of the quality of our homes. But we really need to bring greater focus to those issues. And then I think we can accelerate in terms of meeting targets, whether it's to 2030 or beyond. But I think with all the sort of the gloom that's out there, it's very easy for people to say, okay, it's impossible. And you can see that with the new form of climate deniers and delayers. But you know, like there was a report out today in a rival media outlet that we could meet our first carbon budget up to 2025, which is remarkable. The analysis shows that we are actually on a path of getting off fossil fuels in Ireland. The trouble is we need to just accelerate that even more. So there's a lot of ways we can push through. And I would echo what David and Sadhbh have said in particular. And I would use the word pace. There's a lack of pace. There's a lack of urgency. And we really need to push on that, because the time frame is narrowing. And okay, it doesn't look great at times, but we really just need to bring that relentless focus. Now, I can acknowledge at government level, there's quite a significant change in the last 4 years. And for example, they have this new task force mechanism in the Department of Environment and Climate, which I think is a really good way to go. But again, if you dig into that scenario, there are issues there about pace, and you know, we can talk more about specific issues. I have a particular interest at the moment in offshore energy, and I think that the targets are very impressive. I think we can become a really energy independent country underpinned by renewables, but there are obvious things about ports that would service offshore wind farms. There's a lack of DMAPs beyond the south coast, which we really need urgently. We need to have a demonstrator floating wind farm. We need to really action floating. If you look at what the big European energy generators are doing, notably Spain, France, Germany, and Holland, and I'm not saying we can be at that scale yet, but we're not pushing through on that as a sort of a simultaneous development frontier. But overall, I think we know we can get rid of those blockages, and it is to do with communication, but it is to do also with agreeing that we're going to prioritize certain things. There's so much that needs to be done, but I think a focus on priority would really be helpful. And just to say, given what the topic of this gathering is today, I have a science hat as well. I'm particularly impressed always about the ability of Irish scientists to understand what the issues are immediately affecting Irish society and to respond accordingly. Now, there are funding issues, but I think that, you know, that tranche can really feed in a very meaningful way. And I would be greatly reassured that, you know, the degree of innovation of new technology that will be needed, a lot of it will come out of that stream.
That's great, Kevin, and thanks again. I think another rich answer with plenty of food for thought for researchers. Trish talked about COVID, and I was thinking about the intensity of the communications during that period, and it certainly was a time where I think many of us felt we came together to support each other. How do you think do you think we can get to that level of intensity of communications through various channels when it comes to climate, or do we just take people straight to overwhelm? I mean, you know, what are your thoughts there?
The risk is overwhelm, and then you're fueling the doomism. I think it just has to be really channeled well, and the issue of cost is huge, and I think there are very obvious benefits from pursuing climate actions aggressively, and I think it's getting that message across too. I think, you know, once we can get over the misinformation, the degree of turn off, and the disconnect that people have, I think then we're going to get much better pace and much better understanding and row in terms of people doing things. I would say actually Ireland is in a good place in the willingness side of things, you know, but they just need to be enabled, and we can discuss that as well in terms of what actions would happen there. But I think we're not in a bad place overall. But again, I go back to the climate science, you know, that we've had a terrible year, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. And it's not a question of reversing climate change. It's really calming the whole system down to mitigate against its worst effects, in the hope that we will still have a livable planet.
That's great, Kevin. And can I open it up for Sadhbh and David before coming back to Oonagh, perhaps on just transition maybe, and some of the equity issues and government's role there. So, Sadhbh, David, any further reflections on the communications? Maybe start with Sadhbh.
Well, I have one perspective,
or other aspects,
which is born out of a recent piece I wrote for the Irish Times, actually, about public perception of wind turbines in the landscape. And I expected to get a lot of grief for that piece, to be perfectly honest. And in fact, the opposite happened, where lots of people who lived close to wind farms, or who had a view of an offshore wind farm, the Arklow one, wrote to me saying how much they loved them. And it struck me that the latent support that's often captured in EPA and SEAI surveys for renewable energy is actually real, but we're not tapping into that enthusiasm. And a lot of the negative commentary kind of dominates the local media discussions of renewable energy projects. And there's a real problem there, because the industry has highlighted the fact that many of the county development plans, if not all of them, don't make sufficient provision for onshore wind. The offshore wind will have a kind of a separate kind of planning route. But the onshore wind is being blocked effectively by the unwillingness of planning authorities to mandate for sufficient areas suitable for wind. And that blockage is going to hit us over the next couple of years, and it's going to really impede on our opportunities. And we can't just rely on the planning regulator and the minister to be constantly intervening. It slows everything down. Local authorities need to get with the message. But I think there's a role for the SEAI here in terms of educating the public, bringing school children and the public to renewable energy installations and teaching everybody about energy. People are not literate about it. They don't understand their smart meters. They don't understand what a kilowatt hour is, or what kind of appliances use what energy. Now, with the rolling out of smart meters, we have an opportunity to help people understand what energy is, which appliances use energy, and the benefits of clean energy, and, you know, connecting it to the local renewable energy facilities wherever they are. We have a huge opportunity to do that, because we have so many more renewable energy installations around us all the time. And anybody, and you'll have noticed this yourselves, anybody who has solar panels, because of the way that information is relayed to the householder, people love learning about which appliances use what amount of energy, and the difference that a sunny day makes to a not sunny day. And this is all the kind of lifestyle, energy use conversation that's consistent with a low carbon society, and we need to get with that. And I think so, instead of just thinking about the public as being a mass of people who need to change their behavior, we need to kind of think much more carefully and imaginatively, using the kind of tools that Trish has described there, to engage people and to bring that latent public support into a real demonstration and a real political mandate when it comes around to elections.
That's super. It sounds like through deploying technology, good technology in good ways, we can create advocates and generate stories, and that can get us some wins. What are your thoughts, David? And we come to Trish then, and then Oonagh again.
So many thoughts after opening that conversation, because as some may know, I used to be the CEO of the Wind Energy Association and took firsthand an awful lot of the kind of perception that wind energy was something that the vast majority of people didn't like. And we would have had survey after survey, particularly around 2018, 19, 20, when you could say the conversation around climate wasn't as wide as it is today, and the appreciation for how much wind energy is reducing our carbon emissions certainly wasn't as widely appreciated. I think we could see that even though the story was a lot more positive behind the scenes, what dominated the policy landscape certainly wasn't that. And I think the issue that SEAI raises around land being slowly but surely eroded as places through development plans, and the absolute need for that to stop and certainly be rethought so that we don't kind of take away the lowest cost renewable energy resource we have in the country in the form of onshore wind, because as much as offshore will come with the big bang, and eventually the one that carries the absolute foundations of what we've achieved and what we're going to achieve in the coming years is onshore. But it's not something I talk about too much more because it's not my day-to-day life anymore, but I can't possibly let that one pass. And I'd say there is research for years to be done about the communications that happened over the last 10 years in the world of wind energy. I'd say if I was to go back and do a PhD again, it'd be a topic I'd find fascinating to just be able to go into the ins and outs of how that transpired. But it's just, I'm kind of really just keen to share one perspective as well I'd have from my new world, let's say, which is the heat world. And I can't disagree with anything. It's all really great points about storytelling and good. But the one thing I would flag is it's not easy to make a story, a good story in the heat world in Ireland at the moment. And the reason I'm saying that is, you know, I completely agree we want to get people off fossil fuels. I would love to see that happen. But the story, if you were to tell it to many people, would be, I would like you to stop using something that's relatively cheap, relatively easy, and I would like you to do something that's probably a bit difficult and probably a lot more expensive than what you're used to. Now, I'm not sure there's any comms campaign that will turn that into a reality. That's a very tough story to tell, and you'd want to be a very, very good comms person to bring that into a scalable message. If I take, for example, a different story, if I went to somebody in Copenhagen, I'd be able to go and say, I would like you to, well, there isn't anyone left using gas in Copenhagen. Maybe if I went to the deep suburbs of Copenhagen, I'd find a couple of houses on gas and I'd say, I would like you to stop using gas. And by the way, during the gas crisis, you could switch to this district heating scheme that has had zero increase in cost for the last 10 years. That's a pretty interesting story and one I'd be interested in listening to. And I suppose it goes back to like my whole life or world at the moment, and the thing that I live by is implementation. And what I mean by implementation there is we have to be able to give people something that's cheaper and easier, ideally both, but certainly one or the other, because it won't happen without either. And I think until we crack the nut of making it either cheaper or easier, or both ideally, there is no comms message or there's no marketing campaign that'll make it happen at the scale we need. We need to turn these solutions into something that makes people's lives better. And I think if you can make it cheaper and easier, you'll bring the vast majority of people with you. Whereas I think if it's more expensive and difficult, it's always going to be a niche group of people that'll be willing to take that on board. And you know, so I think, yes, comms important, yes, storytelling important, but even more so, having a good story to tell before you start the comms plan is probably the base point for a lot of it.
Mm-hmm. So some stories are easier to tell than others. Trish, could we get some reflections from you, and maybe then a quick one back to Kevin as a communications expert and storyteller before coming to Oonagh for some reflections. I know there's a lot to reflect on, but Trish, could we?
There's a lot, and I absolutely agree with David's perspective. I think we really need to hear this, that not everything is just going to be neatly packaged into a comms story. And I think sometimes there could be a perception that that's what people in my department might do, whereas what we also do is we research mis and disinformation and discourses of delay, as Kevin mentioned. So while I would suggest that, yes, as Oonagh and Kevin both said, there was a good acceptance of the science in Ireland, we need to be careful that that baseline of acceptance doesn't slip. You know, that we do keep an eye on our acceptance, I don't know, rates or whatever. We keep an eye on the kind of fringe media. We keep an eye on those more nefarious influences coming in. You know, we've seen what's happened in other countries. We don't just want to be further down the timeline. We want to really be proactive about that. So I would suggest that, like, our stories are connected to wider media landscapes, and Ireland is not immune from some of the more nefarious ones. So our media needs to be, you know, like robust, we do need some regulations. If print media and if kind of, you know, like if broadcast media are regulated, we do need to look at regulating the tech giants to a certain extent, and you know, leverage their massive power, their massive broadcast power, in a way that is more helpful. And I agree, some stories are not easy to tell. You know, Sadhbh has discussed about like the kind of maybe bureaucracy that's going with retrofitting. An interesting, just a layperson story. I happened to be speaking to somebody in a fossil fuel company who was trying to roll out HVO as a direct replacement for diesel, as a transition fuel. I thought this could be a good idea, because if you are somebody who can't afford to buy a brand new electric car, but your older diesel isn't at its end of life, a direct replacement that cuts down on emissions, that could be a good transition fuel. No, I haven't had this validated, but apparently these people who are hoping to get HVO out can't do it quickly enough at the pump, because data centers have kind of earmarked it for backup, for backup generators. And so the data centers, if there's a power failure, won't use diesel, they'll use HVO. Now, I haven't verified this, but that could be an example of how we would love to tell a story around transition, but maybe there are details that aren't helpful.
Thanks, Trish. And certainly some technical issues with HVO we'll park to the side, but another area.
Oh, absolutely. It's it's not a solution, but like a small interim that could move a dial for somebody who might be not engaged, but might want to be engaged and might be incentivized in some way as a short transition. Absolutely, you know. Yeah, there's wider issues.
It's a great point, and we're talking about media, so I have to bring Kevin in before getting back to Oonagh. But Kevin, the role of media, and if you could say a little bit about the language as well, the language style, and what you think works. You've been writing for the Times for a while, so.
Yeah, well, I think the role of media is obviously critical, but as I've said many times before, we're not an information service. We have to really present, analyze, and question a lot of the time what's out there. And I think that's in all our best interest in terms of having the real robust conversations. But that said, I went to my first COP in Bonn in 2017, and I was the only Irish journalist there, believe it or not. And last year, I think there was probably 12 Irish journalists there. The extent of coverage of the whole climate issue had multiplied by a factor of 20, I would say. I think Irish Times coverage of climate and energy and all associated issues has probably increased in the last 10 years by even more than that. So that's the good thing. But we have to factor in as well the problems around politics and the immediate crisis of whether it's housing or whether it's water pollution or whatever that distracts from the overall conversation in terms of push through, and that's a problem. And I think the current, I don't want to be unduly negative, but at the moment the political cycle is not good, and you can see that in Europe during the Euro elections. There was rollback forced by farmers in many ways, and you can see this trickle down effect where ambition is being diluted already. Now, it's heartening that the new commission seems to be standing up to that as best it can and retaining the higher ambition. But like we could go into a cycle where there's a radical change again in the US if Trump is re-elected, and you know, doesn't bear thinking about what could happen there. I think in Europe, the major economies are really given their governments are in a fragile state, particularly in Germany and France. And so therefore, there's a risk that we won't be doing things at the scale that we need to be doing them. And there's a risk that after the next Irish election, we could be in a similar situation. And you can see the trickle down then with lesser ambition in the corporate world that are rolling back on net zero targets, which is really worrying. And then in the last 2 weeks, we've seen car manufacturers saying, oh no, we're not going to push the EV side as ambitiously as we thought we would. Again, that's all the the cauldron at the moment, where politics is not pushing through with the level of coherence that's required. And unfortunately, you can see then how the fossil fuel sector, big oil and gas, can exploit that and are exploiting that, and then by virtue of all of that, extending the livelihood of or the viability of fossil fuels for the coming decades. So we as a media organization, we have to fight that. We have to challenge that. And we're not perfect, but we do try to focus on those kind of issues. Unfortunately, going back to the messaging question, sometimes it's complex. Sometimes climate is complex. Explaining it is complex, but we do try and force ourselves to say, look, how can we explain this in a better way? And you know, many of the people that participated today do that instinctively, which is really good, but we probably need a lot more of it.
Excellent. Thanks, Kevin. Can we circle back to you, Oonagh? There's been a lot there. Don't expect you to unpack or respond to it all, but the role of government in engagement and just transition and equity, I think were particularly interesting topics, but I'll leave it to you to respond to what you like, and we'll do one final whip around. We'll give everyone 30 seconds of a sum up after this, and then we'll be done. Over to you, Oonagh.
Thank you. Well, I certainly can't answer to everything in what was a very rich discussion. I think there's a couple of themes I just want to reflect on. Firstly, that this has to be certainly a top-down led thing. Government have to use the levers in its power to do what it can do to change, particularly through regulation on big actors, their behaviours. But it has to be a bottom-up exercise as well, and that means because we don't live in a dictatorship, we live in a democracy, and it's what people want to do. And can be brought to do and convinced to do that will change behaviours. Noted very much about the simple messages, and I've given 2 simple messages, and perhaps that's something we should move to, which is, please change how you move around the island, please change how you heat your home. We'll help you do it, but that's what you need to do to address Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions. And now that will only work for people in domestic settings, and obviously we have to go into businesses, and we have to go into
Oonagh has frozen for me in the middle of making a great point. We've lost Oonagh, so we're going to throw the whole panel up now, please, and we'll give you each 30 seconds to give us some final thoughts. And if we can get Oonagh back, we'll cross back to her comments. Can I start with you, Sadhbh? And it's something along the lines of, you know, what ingredients do you think are missing?
Can I just check my screen has frozen? Can people still hear me?
Oonagh, we have you back.
Sorry, can you? Oh, sorry, my screen froze. I'm not sure what happened.
We lost you for a second, and we have you back. So let's go with your wrap up first, and then we'll come back to the panel because you're in good flow there. Thanks very much.
Okay, so just the space around energy poverty, just transition, and simple messages for people who need help in that space. And we do have a new energy poverty strategy coming out fairly soon, and I think the messaging there is around, we can make your home warm. That at least will take that concern off your plate while you deal with the other aspects of your lives that are troubling you. And I think warm home is a really key message there, and it's something that everybody can buy into. So that's really something where I think we need to place more emphasis. And as I say, it's something in terms of the energy poverty space that we need to work through. And finally, just circling back to the fact we're on a research and innovation panel, and this is a symposium about that. I just want to re-emphasize the areas of research and innovation and work that we will probably be focusing in on. So we need innovation about how we deliver an 80% renewable electricity system. We're not at 40% yet. We need to get to 80%. What do we need to do to get there? That's about batteries. That's about storage. That's not actually about eliminating all fossil fuels, because we're going to need gas no matter what we do. But it's around interconnection and how do we make all those elements work on the grid, and how do we deliver all of that? Secondly, how do we decarbonize those hard to decarbonize areas? What do we use? What do we do in places like concrete? What do we do around transport? Like, how do we get to that space where we can decarbonize, as much of our economy as possible, while still growing our economy and coping with a growing population? So those are the real big challenges. And that's what we need people to be thinking about. And then thirdly, into that behavioral space, how do we convince people that this is what they need to do? Not how do we force people, but how do we convince them? What are the innovative ways we deal with that, and what are the innovative tools at our disposal. So, for example, just to take one specific example, can we take community gain and change it in a way so that we encourage more people to accept, for example, that they're going to have a grid line close to them, but that's it, to pipe that power in from the sea. So it's those sorts of things we're going to need to think, to ask our research community to think about, and to bring us helpful solutions that we can then roll out more widely, to bring the country with us, and make sure we do this in an atmosphere of what I like to call democratic legitimacy. In other words, everybody accepts this is what we need to do. Can I just say one more thing as well, as back into that COVID space, and people messed that. Irish people are quite sophisticated, actually. They kind of know, they read a lot, they hear a lot. Like, the majority of people are very aware of what's going on in their world. And I think that that's a huge advantage to us. That's something we need to tap into. And we need, if we can do that, I think that's what will get us over this line. But anyway, maybe I have this job because I'm an eternal optimist. So that's and thanks very much. A very useful discussion, very, very interesting. Thanks to all the panel and to yourself.
That's great, Oonagh. Thanks for your clarity, and we're glad you have that gig, and thanks for your clear communications today. We're over time, but I really want everyone just to have 30 seconds to give a really quick sum up. I'm going to start with Sadhbh, and then Trish, and then David and Kevin. So please just follow each other on, and then we'll wrap up.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, I'll shoot off with the global impact of climate change. I mean, we are a country with extraordinarily high levels of per capita emissions and also per capita wealth. We have no excuse not to take act, and we actually have a responsibility to developing countries who are struggling to access energy at all. So we have a duty to act, and that points towards the need for not just efficiency, but sufficiency in terms of how we think about energy. We have to get our per capita rate of energy consumption down, and we need to put and reframe some of this very rich conversation we've had in the context of risk and resilience as well. So we're also uniquely threatened as a tiny island, dependent on that kind of friendly Atlantic current that may run into trouble over the next couple of decades. And if that happens, it's an irreversible process that will dramatically change Ireland's climate. So we're totally dependent for our climate on the AMOC. So everything that is happening at a global level, we should be taking a keen interest in, and our diplomatic efforts should be seeking the most rapid global transition that is possible to achieve. Finally, just because it's SEAI's remit, I just want to say how amazing technology is. I mean, I'm a huge fan of renewable technologies, but I was watching a video last night about the Tata plant in Wales. Now they're closing down 2 of their furnaces, but they are going to build the most extraordinary green arc steel plant, which is just fascinating, and will be eventually a completely carbon neutral source of steel production. So there's so much to look forward to if we just get our policies right.
Thank you, Sadhbh. That's great. Trish?
I'll take a pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will approach a bit. So I think what we need to do, first of all, is make sure there isn't slippage on that scientific literacy and scientific awareness in Ireland. I agree with Oonagh, it's absolutely there and we're lucky, but we need to make sure that there isn't slippage. I think what we need to do on a kind of a storytelling level is continue to make those stories, draw from research on existing models that have worked. There's no one size fits all. There'll be a bespoke strategy for keep your home warm. There'll be a bespoke strategy for your car, etc., etc. And what I would also suggest is we need to also not assume that the economy just needs to quantitatively grow more. We need to look at the quality of our growth. And we need to look more broadly than just absolute numbers on a spreadsheet, because that doesn't matter if you've cut down all your forestry and sold it all off. That will show up as good GDP. So I think we need to expand our remit of our research to look at how we can transition to a qualitative approach to our economic growth and what's socially necessary rather than what's necessary on somebody's spreadsheets. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Super, super. Kevin, are you ready?
Yes, I am indeed. I think just to re-echo the message of showing greater urgency, and that equally applies to highlighting the benefits as the speakers have so well articulated in terms of there are cheaper and easier options out there. Okay, it mightn't be easy in the first instance, but we can make really significant progress over time. And I think that will give us a row in that's required to address the bigger issues around decarbonisation, etc. But I think we need to focus on the big wins, such as floating wind, offshore energy, because that's very obvious the case is there for it. I think we need also at the same time need to be mindful of climate tipping points that may affect Ireland terribly, whether it's in the form of extreme weather or lack of food security, which is hard to believe in a country that's rich in agricultural production. But we have to be really conscious of that. And I think, as I said earlier, build on the resilience and adaptation planning and the deployment of nature-based solutions. We're starting on that front, but we're not there yet. And I think finally, just given the topic of today's conference, I think we need to trust more in the ability of Irish science and multidisciplinary research to deliver. And the best way we can do that is increase funding for it.
A round of applause from all the researchers on the call. And finally to David, and fully agree, Kevin, thank you very much, David Connolly.
I think Kevin covered exactly what I was going to say at the start, with urgency and delivering technologies we know work and have been proven. And I think Oonagh actually made a fair point about electricity, that we are now probably leading rather than following, in the sense that 80% from variables is going to be something that no one has done before. But in my day-to-day life of heat, you know, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, they're all at 60, 70% renewable heat, and we're at 6%. So I think that's the type of low-hanging fruit, because it's funny, like, we spent a lot of this conversation maybe dwelling about data centers. Data centers, I'd say off the top of my head, are 2 million tons of CO2 a year. Ireland's buildings for heating are probably 12 million tons a year. So I think there's so much we could do by solving problems that we know solutions are there to solve and don't require compromises one side or the other. They simply require, again, going back to my implementation word, and I think it's, if we can make them easier and lower cost, we will solve so much of that challenge, because you can absolutely scale a message when the message is, I can make your life easier and lower cost to live.
Thanks, David, and really appreciate those final thoughts. And thank you too to all panel members. I think it's this kind of depth of discussion and engagement that really gives us hope. And hopefully all the researchers in the call heard things for themselves in it too. So again, a final thank you. And I'm going to pass this back now to Irene Ward from SEAI, who's going to sum up today's conference. Thanks again.
Thanks, Jim. And so firstly, I would like to thank everyone for contributing and attending our SEAI National Energy Research and Policy Conference this morning on Ireland 2050, or Innovative Energy Future. We started the morning with our chair, Margie McCarthy, who introduced Emma Lynch and Andries Magnuson. Through data projections, Emma outlined the stark gap that exists between our current path and what is necessary to achieve our 2030 and 2050 emissions targets. The figures showed the rapid implementation of measures that are needed to achieve Ireland's energy efficiency obligations and to increase our renewable energy share. The complexity that exists within our system was recognised, and our success will depend on many interlinked factors, including policy research and innovation, investment, behaviour change, and demand reduction measures. Timing is everything, and each year of delay diminishes the power of the cumulative effects of our actions. What can we do now to change the path? What can we do differently? And is there any wasteful growth that can be identified? We were pleased to have Andries Magnuson present his views on the importance of language, understanding and messaging when engaging and encouraging climate action. Andries related the changes that took place over the lifetime of his mother, or of his grandmother, born in the 1920s. Great changes have taken place, but the Icelandic glaciers that were thought to last forever have now been vanishing at human speed and will be largely lost by 2160. The fossil fuels that enabled the rapid development of the last 150 years now look like they're harming us. And looking to the future, people we love will still be alive and will have influences out to 2160. So it's like a handshake of generations. Everything that we do today means something to people who are coming after us. And in the context of storytelling, narratives work best when they engage us at a personal level. During the research sprint, Anne-Marie Colbert chaired 2 sessions where we heard from current research projects in key areas for enabling us to reach our clean energy targets. The first section focused on wind turbine monitoring, energy efficiency in the built environment, including indoor air quality, large-scale deployment of solar PV farms and interconnections with energy grid, scaling up test site structures of Ireland for offshore energy and the broader sector, and the challenges of potential and potential for floating offshore in the extreme Atlantic conditions in Ireland. In the second half of the research sprint, we had presentations covering the importance of feasibility studies and accelerating district heating in Ireland, diversification and anaerobic digestion in farming in Ireland, tackling energy poverty through retrofit analytics, and a wider EU project on testing platforms for local electricity markets and app development, and also a project encouraging and understanding behaviours around switching to EVs. In the final session, chaired by Jim Scheer, we were delighted to have Oonagh Buckley, Secretary General of our parent department DEC, deliver a keynote address. Oonagh stressed that we have moved well beyond what we thought we were capable of 20 years ago in terms of renewable energy, and we had the highest ever figure for renewable energy last month. However, the urgency to move away from fossil fuels has never been stronger and more pressing. We need to achieve targets for tripling our renewable energy and doubling energy efficiency. The department is working in many ways to deliver and enable changes such as the Climate Action Plan, and also investing 50 million per year in research and innovation through SEAI, GSI and EPA. There is much more to do to build a strong base of evidence for policy, examine behavioural insights into travel and heating patterns, and enable citizens and groups to actively engage in achieving our climate targets. In addition, there are implementation challenges to address in grid modernisation, planning procedures, infrastructure capacity, and building a workforce to deliver targets. Governmental supports are evolving to respond. Our expert panel discussed many challenges that we are facing in implementing solutions, and brought us back to what we need to do now. Lessons and messaging from COVID could be used to engage people and present opportunities. For example, there are many benefits to the transition. For example, cleaner air and warmer homes. We are in a strong place, and we need to harness the willingness and focus that enabled the progress we have achieved so far. Fairness and exploring alternative means of communication were highlighted, and we are not all in the same situation, and a just transition is very important. Climate choices may seem remote if primary or other needs are not being met. More research is needed in engaging the unengaged. In addition, all stories, for example, increased cost of energy, are not easy to bring across. The role of media and communication in climate communication has increased immensely, but global political cycles can affect ambition, as seen during this year. And so the main areas are for research and innovation are: how do we get from 40% renewables to 80%? How do we decarbonise the hard to decarbonise? And how can we bring everyone along with us? The need has never been stronger or more pressing. We as citizens, researchers, industry and policymakers can all come together, and if we understand what we have to do, we can design and deliver innovative solutions. I'd like to thank everyone once again who attended this morning, and all the speakers, panel members, session chairs, the SEAI RDD team, the SEAI comms team, and our platform organisers for being part of the event. Thank you.